chapter called the 13th Amendment in the Senate. This particular chapter here, I mean, there's so much powerful information in this work of literature.
Islam.
But specifically, this chapter here is very powerful. I believe this chapter is an excerpt out of the book, The Great Conspiracy. So you can find this chapter available in that work as well as this book, The Resurrection. The chapter is about it starts on page 83, it ends on page 106. So in the interest of time, we're not going to be able to go through the entire chapter, but we're just going to go through some highlights.
Teach on.
So when you read the first 2 pages or so, it kind of goes into some background history. Let's see if there's anything like. Basically, during the Civil War, you had the war over slavery, as we already know. But what's important to grasp in this chapter is that Congress, basically, like anytime you're dealing with Congress and they commission information or something like that, they may have a committee, they will rely on experts and data to kind of come to an understanding of matters. And that's kind of how Congress operates. Because they can't be experts in aviation, but they have to create regulation when it comes to aviation,
Islam.
et cetera, et cetera. So
Teach.
they did this in the 1860s during the Civil War pertaining to the matter of slavery. So they basically went through all documents pertaining to that matter, American as well as historical, foreign, etc. See where I want to have Brother Rick Jason read first, but it's going to be a good insertion point. You know what? Let's just start in the second paragraph. Not the bold, the second paragraph, not including the bold text. It says Trumbo. Don't worry about it, I'll let you know. It's going to pretty much be this paragraph, this whole paragraph.
Trumbull insisted that slavery was at the bottom of all the internal troubles with which the nation had from its birth been afflicted down to this wicked rebellion, with all the resulting distress, desolation, and death, and that by 1860 it had grown to such power and arrogance that its advocates demanded the control of the nation in its interests, failing in which they attempted its overthrow.
So stop right there. That's very important, that last quote that he said. So just to put it in context, Trumbull is kind of saying slavery is not that big of a deal. Who's Trumbull? He's a member of the Senate.
Teach.
At that period of time. And he stated its advocates. What are they advocating? The advocates of slavery. Its advocates demanded the control of the nation in its interests, failing in which they attempted its overthrow. So you, right there, you know, according to that senator, Trumbull was saying that what Trumbull was saying was that, you know, those who advocated for slavery sought to overthrow the government because of its stance. But let's continue on.
He reviewed at some length what had been done by our government with regard to slavery since the breaking out of hostilities against us in that mad attempt against the national life. How, in the earliest stages of the war, there was an indisposition on the part of the executive authority to interfere with slavery at all.
So stop right there. So he said that there was an indisposition. So let's take a look at that term.
Teach.
Because he oftentimes will look at a word and you won't look it up. So I don't think too many people are familiar with the term indisposition. So let's
Teach
look
on
at
him,
the
Marcel.
definition. So, noun 1, mild illness. It's not the context that's being used. The second definition is from Oxford Dictionary. Lack of enthusiasm or inclination, reluctance. So what is that sentence saying? So you have some of this language you have to kind of have to decipher. So let's read that sentence again.
Islam.
Since the breaking out of hostilities against us in that mad attempt against the national life, how, in the earliest stages of the war, there was an indisposition on the part of the executive authority to interfere with slavery at all.
So again, there was a lack of enthusiasm. There was a reluctance of the executive authority to interfere with slavery at all, either for or against. They kind of let this situation, culminate to a head. Now, when you study the works of Lincoln, it was his adamant belief that slavery would be such a imperative issue that it had the capacity to tear the nation apart.
Islam.
This is why he was stating that whatever he had to do as commander-in-chief, as the president of the United States, whether it be to keep slavery or to abolish slavery, keep some free and some slaves, whatever it would take, he was willing to do that because he saw the republic falling apart. All right, so we together so far?
Islam.
It's going to probably take us another 2 meetings to kind of get through this particular chapter, but I think it's very important to kind of understand and synthesize it. And it's good that we recorded this so we can have a reference later on.
Islam.
Continue, Mo.
How, for a long time, slaves escaping to our lines were driven back to their rebel masters. How the Act of Congress of July 1861, which gave freedom to all slaves, allowed by their rebel masters to assist in the erection of rebel works and fortifications, had not been executed. And, said Mr. Trumbull, so far as I am advised, not a single slave has been set at liberty under it.
So stop right there. So again, this is the early stages of the Civil War, and as a war measure, as we taught about in previous classes,
Islam.
as a war measure, slaves were set free, but it was basically set free on paper because, as you're going to see going further on, they were set free in territories where they were physically being held captive, but according to law, they were recognized as free. But that freedom wouldn't be into effect until former slaves were able to escape in Union-controlled territories.
Islam.
All right, continue, Mo.
How it was more than a year after its enactment before any considerable number of persons of African descent were organized and armed.
So stop right there, organized and armed. So again, this is a war measure. They weren't just freeing slaves because they felt that it was morally wrong. The South was very formidable. And the Union was taking heavy losses and casualties. So in order to gain a tactical advantage, they decided to begin to arm the former slaves to fight against the Southern Confederates. And the incentive for the former slaves was obviously they'd be able to earn their freedom
Islam.
in a wage or something to that effect. Whereas although they would be paid less than, quote unquote white soldiers or free soldiers, they even had the opportunity to make money as well as fight for their freedom. Continue, Mo.
Persons of African descent were organized and armed under the subsequent law of December 1861, which not only gave freedom to all slaves entering our military lines, or who, belonging to rebel masters, were deserted by them, or were found in regions once occupied by rebel forces, and later by those of the Union.
Stop right there. So 3 types of so-called slaves found themselves freed according to this law. So again, this is important because we have to know what are the laws that freed us. And these particular laws, again, with war measures, they didn't free all so-called slaves everywhere in the United States. They freed specifically these 3 types of slaves, which is, once again, any slaves entering into military lines of the Union Army. So that could be, slaves who either escaped from their masters or, slaves who were brought into that territory by their slave masters and had their property, i.e. the slaves, confiscated by Union soldiers, etc. Belonging to rebel masters. So again, that's kind of similar, but but deserted by them, meaning they left their masters for whatever set of reason. And the ones that were found in regions occupied by rebel forces. So say, for example, the Union Army was to conquer a particular, Confederate territory. All the slaves in that territory will be set free, given the opportunity to fight for their freedom and armed.
Islam.
Continue, Mo.
Or were found in regions once occupied by rebel forces and later by those of the Union, but also empowered the president to organize and arm them to aid in the suppression of the rebellion. How it was not until this law had been enacted that Union officers ceased to expel slaves coming within our lines, and then only when dismissal from the public service was made, the penalty for such expulsion. How by
Stop right there. So because we're about to get into. So boom, he said a lot. Union officers during this time, before the law was enacted, and it didn't even have the full force and teeth, Union officers were expelling, meaning they were sending away former slaves. They were basically kicking them out of Union territories. So again, he's about to read the initial Emancipation Proclamation is what was the law that kind of made it carry a heavy penalty for soldiers to do that. So soldiers would, from that point forward, discontinue expelling slaves and execute the law that Lincoln had passed through the proclamation. Slow.
How by his proclamation of emancipation of September 1862 and January 1863, the president undertook to supplement congressional action, which had therefore been confined to freeing the slaves of rebels, and of such of these only as had come within the lines of our military power.
Stop right there. So that's a hold on 1 second, Moses. So that's an important aspect right there. So first off, the proclamation of September 1862 and the proclamation of January 1863. So the proclamation of September 22nd, 1862 was called the Initial Emancipation Proclamation, which was the precursor and set the date of January 1st, 1863 for the provisions of that law to go into effect.
Islam.
We're going to go a little bit into detail on that in a little bit, but I kind of want to get to the overview of this because we talked about all these laws that lived in the past, but essentially the September 1862 proclamation freed the slaves within enemy territories, guaranteed military protection through the executive branch on down for former slaves, and it also had measures to deal with colonization, assistance of the United States of America to help Moors colonize parts of America or other parts of the world. Those provisions took effect in January 1863, January 1st, 1863, and those provisions, so January 1st, 1863 proclamation didn't essentially introduce anything new. It just was like, all right, this is the date, it's set, what happened. It says that the president undertook to supplement congressional action, which was basically the Congress had only passed laws pertaining to, freeing the slaves of rebels, and such of these only as had come within the lines of our military power. So again, the September 22nd, even within the territories of the Confederacy, the slaves that were of the Confederate territories, they were set free by this law. Although not physically free because the war was still going on, but on paper. By also declaring free the slaves who were in the regions of country from which, that's what I just said, authority of the United States was expelled, and how The force and effect of these proclamations were variously understood by enemy. Okay, am I going too far? Did we go past that part already? I think I went too far. All right, well, we're gonna, so
Go ahead, Mo, you working?
the president undertook to supplement congressional action. So, again, in the year of 1862, December 15th, the Congress had voted 78 yeas to 52 nays that the president had the power to create law during this present rebellion of the Civil War.
Islam?
And that power coincides with Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution, which reads in part, you want to read?
United States Constitution, Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on the application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened.
Not right there. So, on application of legislature or when the legislature can't be convened, the executive. So, the president or the United States shall guarantee this union a republican form of government, shall protect it against invasion or I should let him finish reading it. And shall protect them against invasion and on application of legislature or the executive when legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So that's a very important aspect of it. Domestic violence means violence at home. And the Civil War was domestic violence. So the executive branch was given authority to make law in situations of insurrection or rebellion within the United States. So, again, what was happening with Congress? Many members of Congress had defected to join the Confederation, or the Confederacy, which was, in rebellion against the United States of America. So that prevented the Congress from being able to fully convene and pass laws during the time of the rebellion. So in order to supplement that, the President Abraham Lincoln utilized the authority granted in Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution to administer law pertaining to the existing rebellion, slavery, etc., etc. Islam, you want to continue?
Yeah. By also declaring free the slaves who were in regions of country from which the authority of the United States was expelled, and how the force and effect of these proclamations were variously understood by the enemies and friends of those measures. It being insisted on the one side that emancipation as a war stroke was within the constitutional war power of the President as Commander-in-Chief.
Stop right there. Again, we already read Article 4, Section 4. And you can reference December 15th, 1862, that congressional vote agreeing that the president had the constitutional authority to create law during that period. Continue, Mo.
And that by virtue of those proclamations...
Stop right there real quick, just 1 second. Proclamations typically don't have the force of law. But again, with Article 4, Section 4, and the congressional vote, that's what gave his proclamations the force of law. So I'm not saying that proclamations in themselves make our law. I'm saying the proclamations passed by President Abraham Lincoln, which is known today as Abraham Lincoln's executive will. Those are laws.
Proclamations are usually what then, as opposed to this is?
They're just basically kind of like executive declarations. Yeah, but things that come out of the executive branch are only binding in terms of law for members of the executive branch. All throughout that bureaucracy. So, from the president on down to...
Was within the constitutional war power of the President as Commander-in-Chief, and that by virtue of those proclamations, all slaves within the localities designated become ipso facto free, and on the other, that the proclamations were issued without competent authority.
All right, so that's the argument against Abraham Lincoln's proclamations being law, that he didn't have the authority to do so.
And had not effected, could not effect the emancipation of a single slave, nor indeed could at any time, without additional legislation, go farther than to liberate slaves coming within the Union Army lines.
So that's basically saying, like, yo, those proclamations, they don't really have no power. They can't really do anything. You know, it's only going to be effective within Union lines because the Union already controls it. Let's see, should we go fast forward now? No, I think we can continue.
After demonstrating that any and all these laws and proclamations, given to each the largest effect claimed by its friends, are ineffectual to the destruction of slavery, and protesting that some more effectual method...
Just skip to the next... Well, actually, no. Skip to the last sentence. Well, you know what? Just finish that paragraph, whatever. Are you after demonstrating? Are you over there? After demonstrating in that paragraph? Yeah. Continue where you was. I'm sorry.
Okay. Are ineffectual to the destruction of slavery, and protesting that some more effectual method of getting rid of that institution must be adopted. He declared as his judgment that the only effectual way of ridding the country of slavery, so that it cannot be resuscitated, is by an amendment of the Constitution forever prohibiting it within the jurisdiction of the United States.
All right, so right there. Remember I was telling y'all about the movie Lincoln? Now, the whole premise of the movie Lincoln, you've seen it, right? Yeah, so the whole premise of the movie Lincoln, the focus and fixation of President Abraham Lincoln during that time, correct me if I'm wrong, was the passage of an amendment.
It's long.
That was his main focus in terms of his legacy as a president, that he had to get this amendment passed. Again, even to the point that he delayed the end of the war just so he could make sure that this legislation got passed through.
Teach.
So more bloodshed, more death resulted by delaying the end of the war, but he wanted to make sure that all of those that had died in this war had not died in vain.
That's long.
The United States of America could be preserved.
He had to, so it wouldn't happen again.
It's long.
Right here, so it wouldn't be resuscitated.
Because it wasn't simply a matter of just coming to peace.
Right.
What was the cause of the war in the first place? It's like having a illness, but you taking something that's dealing with. It doesn't cure the illness; it just masks the symptoms.
Right.
You're still going to have the illness, and the illness that was plaguing the country at this time was called slavery.
It's long.
All right, continue, Mo.
He then canvassed the chances of adoption of such an amendment by an affirmative vote of 2/3 in each House of Congress, and of its subsequent ratification by 3/4 of the states of the Union, and declared that it is reasonable to suppose that if this proposed amendment passes Congress, it will, within a year, receive the ratification of the requisite number of states to make it a part of the Constitution. His prediction proved correct, but only after a protracted struggle. Henry Wilson also made a strong speech, but on different grounds. He held that the Emancipation Proclamation formed together a complete, absolute, and final decree of emancipation in rebel states, and being born of military necessity, and proclaimed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, is the settled and irreparable law of the Republic.
You know, let's skip some of that. Let's go to page 88. Let's go to page 87. Let's go to the paragraph where it says the fourth paragraph. I guess it's the third actual paragraph on the page where it says this fact was
well set forth in this very debate by a senator from New England, when after adjuring the anti-slavery men of the age not to forget the long list of slavery's crimes, he eloquently proceeded. Let them remember, too, that hundreds of thousands of our countrymen in loyal states, since slavery raised their banners of insurrection and sent death, wounds, sickness, and sorrow into the homes of the people, have resisted, and still continue to resist any measure for the defense of the nations, if that measure tended to impair the vital and animating powers of slavery. They resisted the act making free the slaves used by rebels for military purposes, the confiscation of rebel property and the freedom of the slaves of rebel masters, the abolition of slavery in the capital of the nation, and the consecration of the territories of free labor and free laboring men, the proclamation of emancipation, the enlistment of colored men to fight the battles of the country, the freedom of the black soldier who is fighting, bleeding, and dying for the country, and the freedom of his wife and children. And now when war has for nearly 3 years menaced the life of the nation, bathed the land in blood, and filled 200,000 graves with our slain sons, these men of loyal states still cling to the falling fortunes of the relentless and unappeasable enemy of their country and its democratic institutions. They mourn and will not be comforted over the expiring system in the border slave states, and in tones of indignation or of anguish, they utter lamentations over the proclamation of emancipation and the policy that is bringing rebel states back again, radiant with freedom.
So understand that when you go back, what Senator Wilson is trying to say is that you have people who are loyal to the United States, are loyal to the Union, but resist the abolition of slavery, resisting the proclamation, resisting black soldiers being a part of the quote-unquote so-called black soldiers being a part of the Union or what have you. Even though that they fought, even though they sacrificed their children, even so many lives lost. And again, this debate is the precursor to the 13th Amendment with 20 sections. So this is the debate a debate passing an amendment to abolish slavery in all territories within the United States. So you have to understand that there were vying interests. So some wanted to keep slavery in America, but still were fighting on behalf of the Union.
Teach.
You understand? So you had some people that took issue with slavery. Like, even though we fight on the same side, you with that slavery stuff and we're not.
That's wrong.
So the conflict was so much nuanced. Slavery wasn't just an issue between the Union and the Confederacy. It was an issue within the Union itself.
Islam.
Within members of the Union itself. And Lincoln was very aware of this. This is why the proclamations only specified abolishing or freeing slaves within territories in the state of rebellion and not in the territories that were not in the state of rebellion.
Teach,
because
Master.
had he advocated for freeing all the slaves regardless, just throughout the United States, states that were loyal to the United States, that were taking up arms against those in rebellion, but wanted to keep slavery, those states that wanted to keep slavery, but they were fighting on behalf of the United States of America, preserving the Union, etc., this would have made enemies of them. They may have defected to the Confederacy at that point. That could have turned the tides of the war against Lincoln.
Break it down.
So he couldn't, just as a commander-in-chief, as a military leader, strategically, it would have been foolish of him to try to free all the slaves, even in the territories that were not in rebellion of the United States of America. So the only rational way that he can maintain their allegiance is through an amendment process, a vote. Because even if they're against it and they vote against it, they still bound by the covenant, the contract,
Islam.
the Constitution. And this Moors is actually where it really heats up. You see towards the end, I start getting very passionate because we just had to lay certain groundwork and foundations. So now we're going to go into the debate, how the 13th Amendment came to be, what were the vying arguments, what ultimately led to the creation of the 13th Amendment, and we can discuss what that amendment entails. Because the reason why we're going through all of this is because this establishes what the birthright of the Moors is. So this goes beyond just historically what happened to us. These are the laws that freed us, and what are the birthrights associated with that freedom. So we're going to pick this up again more next week. But with that, I say Islam and peace.
Peace. Islam.